For being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's dive right in. You called that 2019 call, quote, shocking. And in your letter to the White House, I'm going to read a little bit of it. You say, quote, we recognize that U.S. national security sometimes requires engaging with governments and leaders whose values do not align with our own. However, doing so in a manner that publicly flatters, defends, or excuses their conduct undermines U.S. credibility and projects weakness on the world stage. I understand this call is still classified, but can you characterize what exactly shocked you about the call?
Well, look, what I can tell you is this, is that there were two calls in particular that bothered me during my time as a deputy legal advisor, ethics lawyer at the White House. One was the Ukraine call, and as we know, the president, after the whistleblower complaint came out, was impeached for that call. This was the second one. And we know that the president subsequently said during, in an interview with Bob Woodward that he saved MBS's ass. We also know that the president, over the ensuing years, he and his family have benefited immensely from that relationship. And so I can tell you that the call itself was shocking. There's both in the Woodward comment, the quid, and then there's a pro quo in the massive benefits that the president and his family have reaped, and that smacks of corruption.
Can you give me a little bit more detail, Congressman? Was it the tone of the call? Was it conciliatory? Was it the contents of the call? Why exactly was it so shocking and disturbing to you?
So, look, it was shocking to me because by that point, we had already a pretty clear sense that this was an ordered kill capture operation by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and that the intelligence services had assessed that with high confidence, a gruesome, grisly murder in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. And frankly, there's audio and release transcripts where you can hear or certainly read how terrorizing the last moments of Mr. Khashoggi's life are. And so you have those comments, and then you have the stark contrast of the president really welcoming MBS with open arms and then covering for him, even to an extent that MBS himself didn't go to. And so I think that call itself would be very illuminating, again, in my opinion, shocking, and really descriptive of the events that have taken place over the last several years and the benefits that the president has reaped. And ultimately, this is about justice and closure for Khashoggi's widow, a resident of Virginia, Khashoggi himself, a Washington Post reporter, resident of Virginia, and also about transparency for the American people.
Congressman, did anything illegal or impeachable happen in that call, in your estimation? I
would say that that there are events, as I've alluded to, that would smack of conflict of interest, that are potentially corrupt, and the impeachment provisions are about high crimes and misdemeanors. And so that is only after a fulsome investigation and, frankly, a release of these documents and the facts and circumstances surrounding that before we even get into that kind of discussion. I'm a former prosecutor. I act based on evidence and not based on just gut feeling.
But when you say corrupt, as it relates to, and conflict of interest, as it relates to that call specifically, Congressman?
As it relates to the president and how he and his family have benefited enormously from the relationship, and as the president said, for, I think he said, saving MBS's ass.
Let me ask you, because this call between the president and the crown prince happened back in 2019. If you were so concerned about it, why hold on to this information for 6 years? Why not sound the alarm back then, Congressman?
Well, because the tone, by that point, intelligence services were assessing that MBS was involved. He was still, for the most part, in pariah status. But to see all these years later, the president actually welcoming MBS back in with open arms and actually being counterfactual and about what actually has happened and what U.S. intelligence services have asserted. Seeing him in the White House, I mean, that to me was unacceptable.
As you know, President Biden also met with MBS after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Do you think that President Biden may have played a role in MBS's return to the international community?
Yeah, I think so. It's unfortunate. And look, I think this is the infamous fist bump. And, President Biden got some grief for it, probably not enough. And we do have to recognize that we have to deal with sometimes unsavory characters around the world, whether they're Kim in North Korea or Putin in Russia, Xi in China, and MBS and other folks. And we have to be realistic about who these folks are, realistic about what U.S. national security interests, what U.S. interests are, and deal with them. But that doesn't mean we have to whitewash and completely rewrite history. That is what I find completely unacceptable. And frankly, in the context of how much profit the president and his family have received, those conversations way back when take on a much more sinister character.
Let me ask you something. I don't know if you just heard my conversation. I had a bipartisan conversation with two members of Congress, Kylie and Jacardo, and we discussed the fact that President Trump has called and accused some Democrats of seditious conspiracy because those Democrats called for service members to refuse to carry out orders if they believe those orders are illegal. It's a response to some of the strikes that we've seen against alleged drug boats. You heard Congressman Kylie say that he doesn't condone the comments by President Trump, but he also doesn't think it's right for these Democrats to be calling for service members to ignore orders. What say you of this?
No. Well, look, I was a former troop commander and a prosecutor, as well as legal advisor in the NSC. I was involved in many of the decisions that, senior leadership. And you cannot litigate those decisions. I think the representative from California, the Republican representative, said, we should litigate those. No, those are split-second decisions. We expect soldiers, service members to make those decisions. Let me flip that on its ear for just 1 second. If a soldier was saying, hey, I was only following orders as their defense for executing an illegal order that resulted in the death of innocent civilians, which I believe in Venezuela, those operations are in fact highly problematic and likely illegal. You think for a second that they would not be prosecuted for executing those orders just by saying that they were following orders? No. That is a defense we know in the World War II context with German soldiers absolutely did not work. And so our expectations of our service members are much higher. They're expected not to follow illegal orders, and that's they can be held liable if they do.
All right, Congressman Eugene Vindman, thank you so much for your perspective on all of this today. We really appreciate it.